Welcome to this History Revision Timelines video. Today we'll be looking at when Charles I became king in 1625 and see how his early relationship with Parliament set the groundwork for the instability experienced later in the century. This revision video is mainly based on the Edexcel A-level course from 1625 to 1701, but I hope can be used for any other courses on the 17th century. As ever, if you find this video useful, please do like and subscribe. This timeline from 1625 to 1629 covers the main events that led to Charles's personal rule. The events that you can see here are the main events you need to learn in order to understand why it was so difficult for Crown and Parliament to see eye to eye. We will of course look at these events in more detail, starting with when Charles became king in 1625. The focus here should be on how ready Charles was to rule. Only 24 when he was crowned king, there are a number of things you should know in order to understand how prepared he was to face the upcoming challenges. Firstly, Charles was actually never brought up to become king. That duty fell to Charles's older brother Henry. Henry was by all accounts charming, popular, and had been given the appropriate training to become king. Charles, by contrast, was seen as reserved and awkward. So when Henry died, the burden of responsibility that now fell on Charles was immense, given his inadequate preparation and also the fact that he would forever live in the shadow of his older brother. Indeed, Simon Sharman notes that the suits of armour Charles inherited from Henry were too big for Charles, highlighting the disparity in stature between the two brothers. It is also worth knowing about Charles's unsuccessful attempt to marry the Spanish Infanta, who was the King of Spain's daughter, in 1623. Charles travelled to Madrid hoping for an audience with the King of Spain. When he arrived, the King of Spain made him wait outside for several hours before unceremoniously rejecting Charles's proposal. The whole situation was humiliating for Charles and damaged his reputation both at home and abroad. Another aspect about Charles that is important to note is his belief in the divine right of kings. This is the notion that a king has been chosen by God and is therefore only answerable to God and no one else. He is essentially above the law and no parliament could hold him to account. Much to Parliament's dismay, Charles had the good sense to say as much, highlighting the difficulty it would be for the two to form a working relationship. The reality was, though, that Charles needed to work alongside Parliament, as only they had the legal right to collect taxes. As it happened, the royal treasury in 1625 was empty. This meant that Charles would have to work alongside Parliament in order to raise sufficient taxes to fund his wars against Spain and France. We will now look to see what happened when Charles called his first Parliament. The fact that it was dubbed the Useless Parliament gives you an idea of how successful this initial meet was. In June 1625, Charles had already done two things to irk Parliament before they had even had a chance to meet. Firstly, he had married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic, and secondly, he had promoted Richard Montague, an Arminian, as his chaplain. To understand why this would annoy Parliament, it is worth looking at the religious context. By the 17th century, Western Europe had been divided into Catholic and Protestant religions. Given the Spanish Armada and the Gunpowder Plot were within living memory, it is no surprise that English Protestants treated Catholics with suspicion. Consequently, Charles's marriage to Henrietta Maria was not the most popular amongst England's ruling elite. You also need to understand that Protestantism wasn't a single religion, but rather an umbrella term for a variety of different churches that disagreed with the Catholic Church. Within Protestantism, you had a number of different churches with different beliefs and practices. On the one side of the spectrum, you had Arminianism, which followed principles that were very similar to the Catholic Church. On the complete opposite side, you have Puritan beliefs. With the appointment of the well-known Arminian Richard Montague as Charles's royal chaplain, it was clear that Charles was leaning towards Arminianism. This caused concern for the predominantly middle-ground Protestants in Parliament. So, with this context and the knowledge that Charles needed money from Parliament, it is no surprise that Charles's first meeting with Parliament has been dubbed the Useless. Firstly, Parliament refused to grant Charles tonnage and poundage for life. Tonnage and poundage was a tax that Parliament would ordinarily grant to the monarch for the entirety of their reigns. The problem was that Parliament were not too keen on Charles's choice of advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. Charles saw Buckingham as an impressive, flamboyant father figure he could rely on and had bestowed on him various lands, titles and opportunities. Parliament, in contrast, disliked Buckingham as they saw him as a corrupt and incompetent. In protest, Parliament decided to only offer the tonnage and poundage for a year in the hope that Charles would listen to their concerns. Charles, who was extremely loyal, was outraged by this perceived snub from Parliament. To add insult to injury, Parliament then decided to impeach Duke of Buckingham. Outraged, Charles decided to dissolve Parliament after a few weeks without even accepting the tonnage and poundage tax. The ability to shut down a parliament was very much within a monarch's right in the early 17th century. However, a disastrous military campaign in Cadiz, coincidentally orchestrated by the Duke of Buckingham, meant that Charles was desperate for funds. Hoping that they would prove more amenable second time round, Charles called for a second parliament in February 1626. Unfortunately for Charles, any hope that Parliament would be more understanding rapidly vanished, as MPs used the sessions to further criticise Buckingham and call for his immediate impeachment. Charles, loyal to a fault, backed his favourite adviser and promptly decided to shut down Parliament once again. Still, in dire need of cash, Charles decided to raise a forced loan. This is pretty much what it sounds like. Charles used pressure and coercion to make wealthy landowners and merchants give him money. Charles claimed he was using emergency powers, but from Parliament's perspective, he was behaving like a tyrant. Furthermore, by raising a forced loan, Charles was deliberately overriding Parliament's right to collect taxes. Indeed, after another failed military campaign in La Rochelle, people began to protest and refused to pay the forced loan. Charles acted swiftly by arresting any refusers. The legality of whether Charles was entitled to arrest people came to a head in a landmark trial called the Five Knights case. Charles, citing his right as a divine right monarch, narrowly won, but the episode alarmed the ruling elite as it showed how willing Charles was to ignore the law and subsequently infringe upon their rights. By this stage, the financial situation was proving critical, and Charles hoped he and Parliament could start afresh by calling a third Parliament in March 1628. In order to settle their differences, Parliament offered to grant Charles tonnage and poundage for life on the condition that he would agree to sign the Petition of Right. This was a list of clauses that sought to protect English people's rights and included things such as no taxation without Parliament's consent and no imprisonment without a fair trial. Charles agreed to these terms and gladly welcomed the extra revenue he was now receiving. For a short while, it seemed like Charles and Parliament might be able to work together. However, in August 1628, the Duke of Buckingham was assassinated, and this sent Charles into a spiral of despair. To compound matters, some members of Parliament were visibly celebrating the Duke's death. Charles, in turn, began to lose faith in any relationship with Parliament. He quickly turned his back on the Petition of Right by continuing to collect forced loans and arresting anyone who stood in his way. Parliament responded by criticising the King's actions. Charles, feeling Parliament had crossed a line, decided to dissolve Parliament. However, before he could, MPs managed to pass 3 resolutions outlining their criticism of the King. After arresting the main culprits, Charles dissolved Parliament and reasoned that he would try to bring some stability to his reign by ruling without Parliament for the foreseeable future. I hope this video has proved useful in giving you a basic overview. Please do use the revision worksheet on the information tab below, and do please like and subscribe. Bye for now.